Hello, Claire. Welcome to Do Good and Do Well. It's so lovely to see you. I'm going to skip the who are you question because I know that there are many people out there who want to understand burnout a bit more and how it's impacting them. So, can we start with what is burnout and what isn't burnout? Big
Yes.
question.
Sure. Okay. I think it's causes confusion because a lot of people use the word really colloquially and they're kind of like, am I okay to be using this word? Does my problem kind of justify that use? But I think if you are beginning to think, am I burnt out? You are in the right place to be listening to this episode. And yeah, it is often what people think around exhaustion is one of the core areas, but there are three domains in burnout, and exhaustion is just one of them. So most people coming to this have that intuitive sense, I'm exhausted. It's a little bit more than that. The official definition, according to the World Health Organization, is that it's this dimension of three clusters that occurs in the context of unmanaged occupational stress, chronic stress. And in my book, I talk about how we've then always interpreted that to mean kind of more like corporate
Mm,
burnout, but actually all sorts of work can occur in unpaid capacities as well, such as parents, unpaid informal carers,
yeah.
students, volunteering. There's lots of ways in which work is available to us, paid and unpaid. And there's lots of research going into all of these areas now. So I think the term started much more as a kind of paid work kind of phenomenon and
Mm.
is broadened out, which is where it's being used a lot more. But yeah, so it's not an official mental health diagnosis, just to say that. It is considered a syndrome, which means a collection of these things that all happen at once, but not with an underlying kind of diagnostic kind of issue underneath, if you sort of mean. It's coming from unmanaged chronic stress.
Okay.
Shall I talk to you what those three dimensions are
Yeah, do.
then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we've got the exhaustion. So that means physical. So that's the fatigue, that heaviness, but also emotional exhaustion, which
Okay,
is
yeah.
when you kind of feel quite wrung out or hollow. And like you've given all you've got to give and there's nothing left. Your emotional repertoire will be reduced. So rather than having access to all your kind of emotions, including those social emotions like kind of compassion and joy, you will struggle with those, and you'll have much more of the kind of fight or flight type emotions, feeling irritable, feeling anxious, impatient, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And being cynical is also quite a strong part of being in burnout. So the second one is when we are quite detached from our work. So we begin to kind of feel like, that passion that we had, that feeling of connection and enjoyment is gone. We're going through the motions, but we're not really connected to it anymore. We're kind of maybe a bit zoned out, even, and the people around us and our other activities that might used to have like lit us up, none of that is kind of touching the sides anymore. So that disconnect is a part of it. And then the final one is reduced personal accomplishment. So this is where you maybe feel like you are doing a rubbish job. So, you might feel like a rubbish therapist or parent or social entrepreneur.
Mm.
Like nothing you do is really good enough. You might also find that because you're so exhausted and you're feeling detached, that you are starting to coast a little bit or cut corners in the way that you didn't used to. So maybe, you're doing just enough to get by. So this then becomes, problematic because you might start to drop balls. And this is where in the book I talk about the 5 stages of burnout, and I think the last two both are burnout, but one is more high functioning and one is clinical. So high functioning is, I think, the one that where people are questioning, am I burnt out or not, because they're masking, probably to themselves as well as to others, how much of those three dimensions they're experiencing. They're so used to kind of pushing through
Mm.
stress, that they're not appreciating how stretched thin they are, and how joyless everything feels. Um, and they're overriding all the signs internally that you would get in in stress, chronic stress, that your body's basically, if you pause and listen for long enough, it'll be telling you, I'm stressed. You'll have some aches and pains. You'll be getting those kind of busy racing thoughts. You're getting a sense of urgency all the time. You kind of, the large skeletal muscles will be holding up so much tension that they'll be achy or hard to switch off. But if you override those indefinitely, you will eventually find that your body just says, no more. I'm forcing a stop here. And this is where we can tip into what then people obviously kind of can see is burnout. Although sometimes they'll meet other diagnostic criteria at that point, like a mental health diagnosis or a physical health diagnosis, because their body has literally said no. So that's where, I've had people who just can't get out of bed in the morning. I've had, somebody who just couldn't find their words, couldn't seem to speak temporarily. And any pre-existing health conditions, physical health conditions can suddenly rear their heads, with heart conditions, with like anything really. It can be panic attacks, and I've had people with non-epileptic attack seizures kind of suddenly rearing up and feeling confused, all stress related. So this is the more the clinical end where someone isn't functioning anymore, and quite obviously needs to come off and stop work. But obviously we are concerned about all the people who are in that high functioning burnout as well, because that's no way to live.
Yeah. As you're speaking there, I mean, there were many points where you thought, oh yeah, that I recognize that. Oh yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah.
And both for myself, but also with, people that I've worked with, I see some of that in them. And I guess it can feel really confusing, can't it? Because, like, I don't know, I'm thinking like for menopause, for example, there are symptoms that come with menopause for some people that could be quite similar to burnout as well. And I guess it's for me, and I don't know if well, you tell me, but I don't know if it matters whether we put a name, like almost like diagnose it, but actually it's about understanding what is happening for us, and regardless of whether it's menopause or burnout or something else, like what is happening and how can we go about making it feel better? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it's really hard because there's that time in your life, if you're also kind of perimenopause or going through menopause, the chances are you're in that section of life where you are sandwiched between a lot.
Yeah.
You probably have some sort of, older generation that you maybe have to be thinking about, but you probably have something going on as well. Well, work is usually a stage where you've got a lot of responsibilities. You've built up to that point where you've got a lot on, and also you might have dependents of your own. So there's so much to like unpick, as well as the hormonal stuff. But yeah, I think if you can kind of come back, there's often questions, how can you tell if this is burnout or depression or, menopause or like all of these questions. And I think these different diagnoses are just terms that are given to a cluster of difficulties, and they all overlap. And actually what's going on in the nervous system can be very similar. It is all the same stuff, really. In depression, for example, that comes about from ongoing adversity, and then that feeling of being trapped can impact on a low mood. And it's really similar to what's happening in burnout, but in burnout, we're just linking that specifically to chronic workplace stress. But your body and nervous system doesn't really,
It's not
know the difference. It just knows it's felt trapped and stuck for a long time with no endpoint. And that's the difference between healthy stress, known as eustress, and chronic negative stress tipping into burnout, is that, your body's designed to manage stress. It's meant for us to kind of have extra energy to get through it. But if there's no end point, this is where we become trapped. And that's why I talk a lot in the book about trauma, because I see it as being kind of the same stuff, really, where we've been trapped in stress.
Yeah. Trapped in stress. I get I mean, your book I would obviously recommend it. That's why I'm having you on the podcast. but I really I haven't quite finished all of it. I've got to the point where I'm like finding out now what do we do? We've identified, now what happens? Um but I think it is really accessible in terms of the, you know, the way you're talking about it. What I really appreciated was that, that there's a kind of bird's eye view to this as well. So you do touch upon the kind of systemic issues that are happening for all of us, you know, the world of work and what those big global issues that are happening at the moment and how sort of that can be impacting on our stress levels and on our nervous system. And so you're sort of going from that big picture but also talking about those small points as well, you know, that those caring duties that we might have. And I really I think it's a really important story to tell, that, you know, yes, there are things that we might need to do on an individual level, but also we are part of this big system that um doesn't help our
Yeah.
stress levels, and we don't necessarily, we aren't able to control that. And I guess for people that I work with who really feel that sense of injustice, that, you know, their core values are about community and bigger than self-thinking and making a difference, you know, when they're working in that way and they're maybe not seeing a difference in the way that they want, you know,
Mm,
nothing is getting better
mm.
despite all the work, but also these big global issues where you're, you know, it's you're consuming it and you can't do anything about it. Like, you can just see, can't you can just see why your body would be full of all of that tension from just
Yes.
those things.
And I think also if you're in that work, very tuned into all the injustices, it's creating that ongoing feeling of not feeling safe. And so
Yeah.
your nervous system is reacting as though it's not safe because, you know, that's what you're seeing all the time. And I talk a lot about in the book, it's all about safety, really, and finding little pockets and ways to reset your nervous system involves coming back to safety. And so how do we do that when all the messages around us and you're immersed in that work all the time?
I was running a workshop, yeah. Was it yesterday? No, maybe it was the day before. I don't know. This week's a bit funny. Um, but you know, that came up, you know, in terms of leadership, how we lead, how we
Yeah.
manage, if we're not creating these psychologically safe spaces for others, if we're not feeling safe. I mean, it's so, yeah, it is really, I don't think I've ever really appreciated that. And, you know, until
Okay.
the work I've done as a coach and reading your book and, you know, these conversations I'm having with people, I don't think I appreciated how important that feeling of safety is.
And I think that's the trickiness with this kind of work is when have you done enough? Because there's always going to be more,
Yeah.
because the injustice and inequalities in the world are big. And the fact that there are people doing this work, you know, often in an underfunded kind of organization because our culture doesn't value that stuff. It tends to value capitalism kind of
Yeah.
values. And so you're kind of like swimming upstream against quite a big tide of everything else. So yeah, finding safety might look like, yeah, community, like these conversations that you're having, um, taking breaks and just acknowledging that this is the case, and maybe also just thinking about what are the tiny goals that you're going to keep working towards, and then pausing and celebrating when you reach those. Because I think it's always easy to be looking at the next thing, very easy to forget all that you've achieved.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think if you are in an organization that is, say, funding dependent, then you're often moving on to the next application or the
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
project. And, you know, and I think, I'm, tell me if I'm wrong, but like humans are naturally more inclined to look at the more negative stuff because they're looking for risk and threat.
Yeah.
And so, you know, rather than us being, I think we have to work really hard to say, well, what went really well? Like, what have we already achieved? What difference have we already made? You know, you almost have to, like I see it in my head as like forcing your head to look in a different direction because we're so desperate to be like, yeah, but we
Yeah.
didn't do that, and there's still this to do over here, and we still haven't fixed it. And that's quite difficult. And I guess the other part that might be being played in this is, if you're a change maker or social entrepreneur, someone who cares about making a difference in the world, sometimes you've got to that place because you've lived that kind of experience.
Yeah.
So it can feel very personal. So saying no and taking rest and not doing the thing can feel, I was going to say, painful in a way,
Well,
because
yeah, I mean, at a biological level, your body might be interpreting that as unsafe. You know,
Mm,
if I take my foot off the gas, then I am unsafe, physically unsafe. So come back to safety again. But also that point about, someone's backstory, what's happened to them that's brought them to this point of wanting to make the change and work and the way they do. There might be there's higher likelihood that they've had some unmet needs. We
yeah.
call this trauma of omission, and it's quite hard. People don't often associate themselves with that word trauma when there's not been, say, a big life event that's happened to them. Some people listening to this might think, oh yes, that is me, but there might be some people who think, well, my life was fine, but what kind of needs did you have growing up and into your kind of adolescence? Were your needs being met? Was there someone attuned to you? Was there someone supporting you? It's more than just a roof over your head and food in your mouth. And when we don't have those unmet, when we don't have all our needs met, we can end up normalizing that and then continue into adulthood not getting those needs met because we don't realize how important it is. And that means our responses to stress aren't as healthy as they could be. Maybe we didn't learn those skills or have them modeled to us, or they
Mm.
just weren't a priority because we had to get through some sort of emergency all the time. So yeah, people might not have the stress management techniques up their sleeve.
So does that mean that people are more likely then to end up in burnout because of that?
Yes, exactly. Because they don't have maybe the emotional literacy, which is that ability to recognize emotions and what the emotions are telling you you need. For anger, for example, is a classic one. You might get people who feel extremely angry at something over here, like external to them. Or they might not associate themselves with ever feeling angry. And then we're kind of looking at, well, why that is. Maybe it wasn't a safe emotion, or they kind of turn it inwards and just show it to themselves, and they're never compassionate towards themselves. So we kind of look at what the different emotions are in therapy and in my book, and what they are trying to tell you. They've all got an evolutionary reason for being there. So
Mm.
emotional literacy, being able to set boundaries. Boundaries involve protecting your time and energy. And a lot of people will slip into these unhealthy stress responses, which involve pleasing others, people pleasing, trying to be perfectionists, set very high standards for themselves so that,
Hmm.
that holds criticism and rejection at bay. Um, and all of that means that we can be very misaligned with what we need. What about me?
Yeah.
People sometimes in therapy, when I ask things like that, or what sparks your joy, and I don't mean what you think you should be doing or what you think others think you should be doing, they can feel really lost, and it's quite sad to feel like that. It's a
Yeah.
grief can be there when we really look at this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can't identify, I'll sometimes ask a question in coaching, which is, what do you want? What do you really want? And it's like, oh, first of all, sometimes the reaction is, "Well, I don't think I've ever been asked that question before."
Yeah.
And you think, wow, that's if we can't identify what we want, then we can't be aware of sort of how we get it, but also, how we can get it and achieve these other things as well. And that if we're burning out, if people listening are on that edge of burning out, then, or even in burnout, I guess, you're not really making an impact. Like, it's a lie, isn't it? It's the brain is sort of lying, going, oh, you're safe by doing all this thing, but you're not making the impact that you're really driven by,
Mm.
because you're exhausted, depleted. You can't identify what you need or what you want. You can't identify, or you can't. Well, you talked about emotions earlier, about sort of your, I can't remember the words you used, but the
Emotional literacy.
emotional literally is like smaller, I guess. Like you don't feel the whole array of emotions when you're in burnout.
Yeah.
Um, like that, yeah, there's something quite sad, I think, about that.
Yeah, and a lot of people will go into this work because they have that compassion and empathy, and then that can fatigue. That ability, empathy distress fatigue, is when we struggle to then continue to feel connected to that
Mm,
that part of our why, and that can be distressing. To realize that. Um, but yeah,
yeah,
I think it's hard. Setting boundaries is one of those things that gets talked about a lot. Is like, well, just start setting boundaries.
just
Like,
yeah,
here are the script. You often see that as a freebie. Here are some scripts of things you can say. But I think what that doesn't acknowledge is like you are feeling very unsafe to do that because it challenges your whole sense of who you are and
yeah.
your identity. And then what else do I do instead if I'm not putting others first?
Who am I?
Who am I? Yes.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, I think that's right. And that I think it's also recognizing with boundaries is a slightly different thing, but it feels important to say it. But I think it's important to recognize that some people will feel more able to set boundaries than others. There's a privilege to be able to set a
yeah.
boundary in a workplace, because we might feel unsafe to do that. Well, it actually is linked, isn't it? It's linked to
Yeah.
safety. So if you are someone who maybe doesn't have as much power as other people in your organization or in your network, then it's really hard to set a boundary because you feel
Yeah.
unsafe to do so. And therefore, I'm thinking about, I don't know, I'm thinking about freelancers maybe who are working with an organization, and they might want to increase their fee, but the power dynamic is that they don't want to do that, because then someone might turn around and reject them and say, actually, we don't want to work with you anymore, because, or someone who's neurodivergent, sorry, or
Yeah.
that it's all so connected and
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many layers to each part of what we're talking about, and sometimes
Yeah,
you have to choose which layer you're able to work on. Um, so the idea of where do I have some ability, like my sphere of control and sphere of
yeah.
influence, is a helpful way of thinking.
Mm.
You know, no matter what is going on around you, you usually have some control over how you can move your respond to your body and how you can respond to your thoughts. And we can also have some sort of sphere of influence on the people right around us, close to us. So with boundary setting, then you might think about where are the little relationships where I do have a bit of, potential, and start practicing there. The safest places you can practice it. Um, the thing with boundary setting, though, is that you will get pushback,
Yeah,
and it's easy to spot pushback when it's someone angry. But when it's someone kind of maybe making you kind of feel like you're the only person for this role, or like, but you'd be so perfect for it, or how will we cope without you, then that's like putting on the guilt. And
yeah,
I
it's
imagine
quite
a lot of people,
manipulative, isn't it?
yes, but it's harder to spot because you're
Yeah,
also kind of slightly flattered and you're kind
yeah.
of feeling it. Um, and so that's still pushback, though. So part of the job there is to recognize that this is still important to
Mm.
stick to your guns, to ride out that emotion rather than letting it rule the roost. Um, but yeah, I think that layer can be done. And if anyone's listening to us who does have more leadership in a company or charity, to think about the fact that you are role modeling. And this literally came up as a conversation this morning in therapy with somebody before we signed in, that they are in a new role, in a trainee kind of position. And we've been talking about work life boundaries, how to potentially try and say no to work, which is super hard because they are the kind of, least, the
Yeah.
least senior, most junior even. And then somebody above them modeled boundary setting by saying, is in response to a request, is this urgent for today? No, I'm going to do it on Monday then. And so that gave them permission to go away and do something similar. It gave them
Mm,
a script and the permission. So, anyone listening to this can be thinking, actually, this is for everybody.
yeah.
And this work up at the top levels can filter down for everybody's well-being. But I think collective action really helps, setting, well-being is often tokenistic, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
maybe cakes on a Friday, or well-being, mindfulness 5 minutes before a meeting, but actually compassionate decision making and not asking too much of each other takes kind of more of a collective well-being approach,
Yeah.
and can have massive impact on everyone's feelings, like thinking about what's on everyone's plates, how many projects, like having these kind of conversations and auditing workload really regularly for everybody and making sure everybody's aware, so they're not asking each other to do favors, or can you just go and do this, or like
Yeah.
those kind of like little ways of asking are actually kind of quite deceptive because they're still asking something of
Mm,
somebody.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I totally agree. This is what we were talking about and on the training that I delivered on Tuesday. I think if you're a leader and you're saying to your team, I really respect your boundaries and go home at 5 or don't answer emails, but then you're sending an email at
Yeah,
11 p.m. And I know there's that, for sometimes, if you've got dependents and you can't do some work at a certain time, you might
yeah,
send that email, but you could also delay it and get it sent out at a certain time and not there's that congruence, isn't there? It's like um let's as you say, let's model it and come together and think, how do we want to be as a team? Or how do we, or if you're working on your own, um like I think it's hard running your own business. You know this, being that you're trying to do all the things, but maybe there's some time to just think, how do I want to be in this? How do I want things to look? What do I want my day to day to look like? Who are the people that I want to connect with and have support from that are going to
yeah,
help give me a bit of perspective, or they're not going to ask anything of me, they just might be there to listen to my
yeah.
rants of, like, I don't know, how to do something on Canva or or whatever
Yeah,
it
I
is.
think having a compassionate accountability buddy, even if it's just to have that kind of connection and intention setting, or I'm closing off my computer at 5, let's just do a check-in text that we're both doing that at the same time. Like, I think there's a really important role there for people who are on their own in a
Mm,
business to have something like that. So who could your buddy be?
yeah.
And because pretty much everyone I know struggles with work-life boundaries, because tech and the new way of working is to be on all the time,
Yeah.
and so we really struggle with setting our kind of time boundaries with work. Even if we are managing to say no to things, that's a second boundary that's hard. Anything that you can do to reduce the cues of work and not feeling safe. So sometimes, I've got a study at home, and I just shut and lock the door to reduce, make it even more friction for getting in and just popping on and doing something in the evening or at the
Oh,
weekend.
that's a good idea. Yeah.
And I had somebody who I was working with who would be often on their laptop in in bed before they went to sleep. We talked about locking the laptop in the boot of the car, at a certain time, so that it feels like an effort to go, get your shoes on and go out into the
Go
car
and
and
do
get
it.
your stuff.
Yeah, but how so the thing that's coming up in my head is I can do those things and I know other people can do them, but then how do you stop the brain
Yeah.
from working? Because that's not so easy to lock in the boot. How do
Oh
you
yeah, I
shut
just I
that?
just unscrew my brain and I pop it in there with
That
the
would be amazing, wouldn't it, if we could do
Yeah,
that?
okay, so I love this question. In the book, I talk about thinking about your nervous system like gears. And
Mhm.
when we are in that kind of stress mode where we're functioning at a way that's like high level achieving, we're getting hits of dopamine, maybe as well as the adrenaline. Those are hormones that are meant for keeping us going to get to the end point where we then arrive at the goal. Of course, this is the problem, is that we often don't arrive at the goal in this kind of work because there's always more on the to-do list. So when you kind of think about, I need to come back into a rest mode, you're in, say, sixth gear on the motorway, you're trying to come down into a 20 mile per hour zone. You have to kind of just do that gradually, and you have excess adrenaline and energy, which you might want to discharge. So think about what that is for you. I find just doing a few laps of the stairs, for example, can be helpful. So it might be something physical, some exercise. Sometimes I just go and, this is going to sound daft, but I get a toothbrush and I go at the grouting.
I don't know
Hell
what
for
you were
leather.
gonna say then.
And I brush my teeth very regularly. Well, that could work. My kids are always like, "What are you doing, mummy? The grouting's like clean."
You
I'm like,
must have amazing
"Oh
gravity.
yeah, yeah, yeah." Or just do something with my hands. I feel
Yeah.
like my brain can't begin to come down until my hands need to be busy for a bit.
Mm.
So this is one tip, like thinking about you being in a certain gear and that you need to come down gradually. You can't just expect yourself to switch off. It's not about switching off, it's about switching gear. And the
Mm.
second thing then is when you're switching down, your brain will take a bit of time to follow that. And so it'll keep throwing out all the, oh, but what about this? You haven't replied to that yet. This hasn't been done. So what you need to do is keep a little kind of notepad and jot those things down and get it out of your brain and put it on the list for tomorrow. We're kind of in that idea often of thinking, when I have a thought, I then need to go and do as my thoughts are
Yeah.
saying. We're using mindfulness skills here to notice we're having those thoughts and to resist the urge of doing it when we've set the intention to stop work. And it
Mm.
takes practice. But yes, that's really important. And sometimes, sharing what your intention is, if you're living with someone, saying, right, I've switched off now, I'm not going to do any more work. If I think of anything, I'm going to write them down in this notepad. They might be like, yeah, all right, do whatever
Whatever.
you want. Yeah. But like, just say it out loud.
Yeah.
It helps a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you say it, because I've started practicing that, but I'll go into my asana and I'll do a
Right.
task, but
Yeah.
then sometimes I'm on my phone and a notification will pop up, and then
Yes.
I'll see a tab up, and so there is something about not using your
Yeah.
phone to collect that information and have it.
I've just got a really tiny little notepad.
Yeah.
It's kind of cute and easy just to kind of have, sometimes I find at bedtime as well, if I've not had, in an ideal world, you have a bedtime routine, because routines really help your nervous system to understand I'm switching down gear now.
Mm.
But sometimes, if you've kind of had a later meeting or something, my brain hasn't had time to discharge all the thoughts. And so then I'm lying in bed thinking, oh, but this, but this, but this. So I just pop it then by my bed
Oh, yeah.
and do that. And
Yeah.
that helps, because that tired but wired feeling, that's really common in burnout.
Uh, yeah.
There's a misconception that we will fall asleep when we're tired, but that's not how our body works. We'll only fall asleep when we feel safe enough. So if
Mm.
you can tell your brain, it's okay, I've got this tomorrow, that tomorrow I'll get onto this, your brain can go, okay, phew,
Yeah.
I'll let go now.
Yeah. 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 I think that's such a good point. I have a little secret. Hopefully, my family don't listen to this episode. But when I finish work,
What is it?
I play Lemmings.
Uh,
I'm slightly addicted. Again, it's on my phone, but like I find the act of just playing Lemmings for 20 minutes, it's the most ridiculous game. And I have to sacrifice lemmings, which sometimes make me feel bad, even though they're not real things.
I don't know
That's
that
like,
game. I'll have
do
to
you
have a
not
look.
know it?
No.
Oh yeah. If anyone knows lemmings, let me know. But if I play that for 20 minutes, that is for
Yeah.
me the shifting the gear. And
Yep.
we're lucky we
Yep.
live opposite a park. I might go and have a wander around the park for a bit. But that, I think that's such a helpful, is it an analogy or a metaphor? I'm never quite sure. But that, that shifting gears rather
Yeah.
than suddenly going from sixth to second or suddenly sixth to stopping, that's quite dangerous. And so
Yeah.
being able to
Yes.
being able
Emergency stop.
yeah, we're trying to avoid the emergency stops for everybody. Um,
Yeah, I like that. And I think computer games can have a bit of a bad rap, but they play such a good role. And there's even studies that show after something really intense and like a traumatic incident, if you do
mm,
a game, a visual spatial game like Tetris, it can help
mm,
you recover more quickly. There's something about the memory storage that is happening, that is the visual spatial task is kind of taxing the working memory a bit, and it
Mm.
helps to put the memories kind of in the right place so they're not going to keep coming up and being intrusive thoughts.
Yeah, that's so interesting because Lemmings is a really visual game. Mm, interesting. I
Yeah.
don't feel so bad about playing it now. How did you, slightly moving away, but how did you, we haven't heard from you about who you are and what you do yet.
Yeah, rude. Just come
Alluded to
along.
it.
Start chatting to you.
How did you get here to this place right now, writing a book on burnout, Claire?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think everybody has experienced personally some sort of burnout in their life. I don't know anyone who's not like certainly the high functioning version. So I've definitely had experiences in the NHS. I don't work in the NHS now, I work in private practice. When I was a clinical psychologist, and I went from being, newly qualified, expect to see 15 clients a week. And over the course of about a year to 18 months, we were then expected to see 25 clients in a week. So it was such a huge jump.
Mm.
And, all of that experience of feeling like I was failing and feeling like I was going into work earlier um, to try and get work done and like overriding my lunch breaks because I didn't feel like I had time. All of those behaviors would kick in. So yeah, and then I moved from the NHS into private practice and took a lot of my patterns that I developed into my private practice. So, a lot of people choose to leave corporate work or, businesses or public sector, partly because they just kind of have enough. And I was thinking, what here I am repeating, or I can have a lunch break because I'm my own boss. Why aren't I doing that?
Yes.
Um, and so I just thought that was really interesting. And I also moved out of London. I look out my window, I can see, the Quantock Hills and Somerset.
Mm.
So it's all right here. I've got all the kind of ingredients for a well like balanced life. So why wasn't I doing it? And I just thought that was really interesting. So my experience in my clinical psychology is a lot of anxiety and trauma and working with burnout as well. I thought there wasn't a book that kind of brought all these things together that have been written by clinical psychologists. There are
Yeah.
other books on burnout written by kind of coaches and research psychologists, but that we all have different models and lenses through which we view distress. And I felt like the lens that a clinical psychologist views things, which is the biopsychosocial model. So blending of kind of your biology, the psychological kind of factors like the people pleasing, the perfectionism, and the social factors, like we were saying, of like power imbalances in inequality and those
Mm.
types of things all together in one place. So I
Mm.
just thought maybe there's space in the world for another book on burnout, written from the perspective of a clinical psychologist and a trauma trained clinical psychologist as
Yeah.
well. And that's why there's such a big thread running through it, like helping people understand what I mean by trauma. I don't mean PTSD. I
Yeah.
mean, these kind of missed opportunities of unmet needs and how life does that to us. And then also you're particularly at risk if you've had a tricky upbringing or any unmet needs early on. And so then what are the skills that you might need to work harder at, around kind of self-compassion? I'm always kind of like, when do I introduce self-compassion? Because
I love
people, yeah,
love
people who,
self-compassion.
I know it's so important, but also people who don't do it need it most kind
Yeah.
of balk at the idea. And so, I'm walking people into what I mean very gradually, and I don't kind of reveal that until halfway through the book. So spoiler alert.
Ta-da! Yeah.
But in a way, hopefully, that people then feel is tolerable. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I haven't finished reading it, but I will. And but I really, as I say, I really love that. Well, I suppose it's like anything. First of all, it's about identifying, understanding what we mean by it. You talk about what do you mean by trauma, you talk about what you mean by burnout. And I think there is something for all of us to, identify for ourselves what we're struggling with, what we're talking about. And then some theories and like you're growing in self-awareness, understanding why things might be as they are. Because I think that's that bird's eye view to be able to look at our lives or look at what's happening and kind of understand the why behind it. And then you move into these really practical, like, and this is what you can do about it. This is what you can. And I love the way that you've just designed the chapters in terms of if you're going from this gear to this gear, these are the sorts of things you can do. If you're doing, if you want to do this, and this is the sort of thing that you can do. I think it's a book that you can read cover to cover, but it's also one of those ones I know that I'm going to be like, okay, where's that thing that Claire said? I need to find it again. There's a really great exercise in there. And you mentioned earlier before we started recording that it's going to be published in the US. Is that right?
Yes. It's going to be published in a few different languages next year, which
Oh,
is
oh, that's
cool. Yeah.
exciting.
So Arabic, Chinese, Polish, and America is the one in January. I haven't actually mentioned the title, I don't think. So the British version is called Burnout: How to Manage Your Nervous System Before It Manages You.
Mm.
And the American title is The Trauma of Burnout, which was the working title. But I think
Okay.
the British publishers felt that we weren't quite ready to hear that in a title. So that's why I kind of introduced what I mean by trauma in the book, but we didn't want to scare the British public off from going in too heavy. Whereas I think the US audience, a little bit more interested in healing and trauma, and kind of that kind of title felt like
Therapy and
spoke to
yes.
them where they were at.
Mm.
So it's been an interesting journey, the whole book process,
Mm.
and like even
How
things.
how did you manage your own nervous system while writing it? Because I imagine the deadlines,
Yes.
how you write it in the right, get it in the right order. I mean, I couldn't even, my brain can't even go there thinking about writing a book. How did you do it?
Yeah, it was interesting because I've never written a book before. So I kind of just I had, do you know what I did actually? I had a little notebook which was just for my book. And at the back of it, I've got it here. I wrote my affirmations because there were times, the bit I found hardest was the imposter syndrome and anxiety about putting work out there when I had to send it to, say, my editor. And then there's that horrible wait to see what they think, whether they think, yes, this is good, or what the hell, you're completely making no sense here. So there was always that horrible wait. So I'd have to go and like reread, and I had things down on that page, like people who believed in me, my other achievements, all those kind of things I need to remind myself in moments like that. So that
Mm.
was one technique. Um, I found that I had to reduce down some other work. I couldn't just do it on top of other things. I quickly realized I couldn't spend a day writing in the morning and then see a client in the afternoon, because my head just, I couldn't shift gear. I think I would hit my flow. I really like writing, it turns out. I hadn't realized that.
Mm.
So discover something new about myself. Um, and yeah, I would feel like I couldn't do both things. It was using two different skill sets, I think. And I needed to just have a whole day. Um, and yeah, when I found, there were times when a chapter, I'd have a vague idea of where the chapter's going, but it was, when you're looking at a blank canvas. So the metaphors that helped me think about it was, one was that it was like a jigsaw that I knew would be, say, a picture of a cat, but I didn't have the picture in front of me of the jigsaw. I just knew it was going to be a cat eventually. And I just needed to keep putting pieces in place until it started to fit. And so that would be just writing something, seeing if that worked. And sometimes I then put that in the drafts and think, well, I'm coming back to that. And then I write something and it just kind of starts to kind of come together. And then sometimes going back and taking bits out and realizing it wasn't right at all. Yeah, and gradually it just starts to come together, a bit like a kind of a sculpture might, kind of come together,
Mm.
and out of a piece of clay it's not there, and you just tweaking, and eventually a book plops out the other side. And my husband was amazing. He kind of, I'm lucky to have that support, because we already have a very equitable partnership. Everything we do is fairly split. He, does pretty much all the laundry, for example, and I do pretty
Mm.
much all the shopping. But we have very even partnership with childcare as well. So I was able just to come upstairs and carry on writing and say, I've got to meet this deadline, and he could just do what he
Mm.
needs to do. And
Mm. Yeah, so it feels like you had your internal sort of support system in terms of what you needed to say to yourself and keep you going, and metaphors to help you get started. And then you had your external support system as well. Those people who
yeah,
could really like give
yeah,
you the time and the space, but also, I guess, notice you needed a bit of stroking
Yes.
and
And
some
and
love
my
and
kids would often
attention.
say, I think you shouldn't be working now, mummy. And I'd be like, okay. But it's hard when you're so passionate about something
It
to switch off. So
exactly. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say something about, you mentioned flow then
oh
in
yeah.
what you've just said, and
Yeah.
that reminded me. I made a note when I read this in your book around flow, and you described it as being moreish and addictive. And I thought, yes, like, and that's, is that around if we're striving for social justice, we really care about it. It's connected to our values, it's connected to our purpose. And then when we're in it, it feels really good. And that description of moreish is like, yes, more biscuits. Like, I'm going to
Yeah.
eat more
Yeah,
biscuits.
yeah.
Like, you
Like I
can't
know
stop
I've had
eating
enough, but I
the
can't stop.
yeah. And that, and
Yeah.
I wonder if that's sort of part of the challenge for people who are in this space of trying to make a difference, is that when you're in it and you're in that flow, it and you care about it, it's really hard to stop.
So this is where when you're getting enough dopamine to keep going. And so this is the moreish part of it, is that dopamine feels good. It fills us up. It's like a little spark, and it's a positive experience. When we step away from the thing that's driving that dopamine production, you can get a bit of a crash. So
Mm,
it's kind of expecting that you're going to get that. And that doesn't mean we need to carry on. It means like just look it in the face and go for the crash, because you're going to come out the other side and then move towards the things that give you positive emotions, but they're gentler. So that's where, if you're fortunate enough to have human connection, that is a really good one. Or animals, for example, as
yeah,
well. They can really anchor us, because this is co-regulation. So I don't know if you get to the book where I'm talking about
yeah,
co-regulation, but
yeah,
co-regulation is essentially the kind of clever physiological science that is around how the human body is built to have chemistry that enables us to connect and maintain relationships. So we get oxytocin when we are in flow with somebody else, when we are enjoying their company or hugging, that kind of thing. It's called the cuddle hormone quite often. But it's not that buzzy, excitable experience like the dopamine is. It's a gentler experience. And I always think a bit like a cat purring, it's
mm,
kind of contentedness. But when you hold that up against the dopamine for most people will always win out, because it feels like buzzy and go, go, go. So you're kind of trying to switch into something else. And it's so important, because when we are in that place of connection and filling up on the oxytocin, that is a real good antidote to the stress hormones. It really allows our body to move into that rest and recuperation place, which we
mm,
need to top up our energy if we're going to go back into the place where we're in flow and thinking clearly. Because eventually, if you're working, even if you're in flow in that moorish place, you're depleting all your resources because you're burning through all your energy. So
yeah,
eventually that's when, with that jigsaw puzzle metaphor, I can't get any of the pieces to stick, and I feel like I'm banging my head against the brick wall, and it's frustrating. It's not pleasurable anymore. And so usually that's the place where I finally go, oh, this isn't Moorish anymore. This is rubbish.
yeah.
But
Feel a
you
bit
really,
sick after all the biscuits.
yeah, yes, yes, I like that. That's great. Um, who'd have thought biscuits would be such a great metaphor? But we'll be running with this. Yeah, so try to do it before you feel sick.
Yeah.
Try to stop before you feel
Try
sick.
to stop before you
And
feel.
expect the dopamine crash, and to do something to help you transition down the gears to
Yeah,
help you with that. And it's the same with the kids when they're playing computer games and you see, you ask them to come off, they're going to get a dopamine crash for the same
yeah,
reason.
yeah. Oh, that
So
makes so much
help
sense.
them expect it, just like help yourself expect it. Like, yes, it's going to feel rubbish for 10, 15 minutes. What do you need?
Yeah,
You need to go and jump on the trampoline or something, like, or,
yeah.
something.
Mm. The thing that's really jumping out at me from this conversation is if we can understand ourselves better, how human beings are built and how they work, it sort of takes that personal stuff out of it. Like, oh, it's me, I can't manage it, I'm no good at running a business, I'm no good at being a leader, all of that sort of stuff. But there's something about that expectation. Like, if you understand it, you can expect something to happen, and therefore you can do something about it. So
Yeah.
you can, go for a walk with the dog, or the dog often comes into my office and sits on the sofa.
Mm.
For those of you who are listening, not watching, I'm pointing at my sofa, and if I'm not playing Lemmings, I'll like stroke the dog for a while. And yeah, but I think I've done that naturally, but actually now I'm like, okay, no, this is a really important part
Yes,
of my
yeah,
day.
value
It's
that. Yeah.
like, yeah,
Build it into your, if you can have some sort of switch down routine from work into evening, especially when you're based at home, I think that's really hard because
mm,
when you're coming home from an office or something, you naturally have that transition where you're
yeah, car
decompressing.
journey or something like that.
Yeah. So maybe, could you switch into different clothes? Could you have a shower? Could you have, even just a different jumper, a different cardigan, like workwear versus evening wear?
Mm,
And then stroking the dog or 15 minutes of lemmings. And my
yeah,
husband has got into the routine of doing 15 minutes of a yoga app because we both work from home a lot of the time.
mm. That sounds
Just
healthier than Lemmings.
he set an intention earlier in the year to try and do some more exercise, so he's managed to stick at it. But yeah, the body will these routines take time to start becoming natural, and
Yeah.
it can feel really clunky. Usually a minimum of 3 weeks, we say, for habits to start to stick and
Mm,
become like default, like something you go and do.
mm.
And even on the tricky days when you're really busy, if you can just do 1 minute of that routine, try to stick to it. We don't want rigidity. It's impossible to always have a day where you've kind of got these abilities to make time for it. But if you can just have like a version on the busy days and a version that's the luxury version.
Yeah. Yes. And I think you do that in your book, don't you? You've kind of got like if you've got loads of time, you can do this. If you've only
Mm,
got like a minute, you can do
yeah.
this. And I think that's really important. As always, I know I say this on every episode, but I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours, and I'm very conscious of time. Um, Claire, if people want to know more about burnout, want to know more about you, how can they find this information?
I'm on pretty much all the social medias as at Dr. Claire Plumley, Plumbly. I create little social media videos, content on TikTok and Instagram. They don't always work so well on LinkedIn. I try to kind of transfer it as a text version, but I am on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. And I've got a website, which is at drclaireplumley.com. I'm also on there, you'll see if you're kind of thinking actually maybe therapy would be helpful, then I've got a group of associates and we offer talking therapies like cognitive behavior therapy, compassion focused therapy, mindfulness, EMDR, which is a trauma therapy. There's lots of different options. And
Mm,
yeah, we would be pleased to help you. We work online, and a few of us are based in Taunton, Somerset, for in person as well.
mm. And yeah, and I would recommend checking out Claire's Instagram/TikTok videos because they are very good. Very, very good.
Thank you.
And read the book. I think if you're managing a team and you can see that there's, this difficulty in managing stress, or if you are feeling like that yourself, this is a really good book to get a sense of this, to understand a bit of the theory and to get some really practical advice. Is it an audiobook as well, Claire?
Yeah, it's on Audible and Spotify Premium. I've just learnt this. If you have Spotify Premium, you get 15 hours included of audiobooks.
Do you?
Yeah, so it's on there. So some people might be able to just switch this straight on and listen to it.
Yeah.
And what I will say is a few people have listened to it and found, because there's a few diagrams and boxes, it like they kind of get into it and then have bought the book later on. So
Yeah.
not that I want people to buy it twice, but just if you are someone who needs to see things visually, then this is a book that does include quite a few like boxes or diagrams or
Yeah.
tables that to present material.
Yeah, and you can do what I've done, which is write in the margins and like going, yes, I
Yeah.
recognize this. Oh, this question mark. And
I've
yeah,
made it sound a bit dry there with boxes and tables, but there are four kind of short case studies that we kind of
yeah,
visit every chapter to bring it to life.
yeah,
And there is an entrepreneur in there.
yeah.
Um,
It's
um,
definitely not dry. It's definitely like it's really, yeah. Some books I'm like, oh, this is taking me a while to get through this, but I was like, it's great.
Thank
Um,
you, Sarah.
Okay, so I will put all the show notes. I will. What am I going to do? I will put all the links in the show notes. That's what I
Okay.
was trying to say. Um, and thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning, Claire. I've just learned loads and I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.